which will also be available after if you haven't got one. Maybe to start with the film we just saw, since I'm assuming most of you watched it. Dennis, I don't know if you can talk, you mentioned briefly in the intro, this movie sits at an interesting time in Hong's career before, at least for the US audiences, the movies weren't quite getting distributed all the time, but it signaled a sort of a shift when he started to work with female leads more. This is slightly more straightforward as far as the narrative, as far as not being quite as, I don't know, it's not in two parts, it doesn't double back, it doesn't do a number of things that other films do, including Déjà Cinema. So I don't know if you can talk just generally about where you think this film sits for him in his career, and also just as general, like the female aspect and what he has done going forward has been quite interesting.
I think it's
yeah, I think it's a bit tricky to try to look for turning points or sort of markers in Hong's evolution, because you know, a film might be different from the previous ones, and then suddenly he'll revert to an earlier style. You know, because after this he would make films that are very structural, like Right Now Wrong Then. And I think that's sort of how he works. It's like there's an evolution, but I don't know if there are clear-cut phases. I think it's a very exploratory process. He tries something, you know, and then abandons a few ideas and picks up ideas from like a film or two ago, and then recombines them in different ways. That seems to be very much how he's evolving, if we're looking at it chronologically. And yeah, this film was not one of my favorites when upon first viewing, but in the course of writing this book, I rewatched all the films, all 27 of them, and all of them improved, which is like, it's a very, I think, unusual characteristic. It doesn't always happen. There's something about this consuming them in bulk kind of improves the experience of Hong for me, and I think for most people too. Yeah, in terms of gender, I don't know, I don't want to kind of oversimplify it, but if you look at, you know, just gender relations in Hong in the early films, it's a pretty ugly like, sort of view of, you know, how men and women relate, and specifically how men are shitty. But I think it becomes more complicated around the time of, well, I think the film that we're going to see next, Déjà Cinema, which we will surely talk about, is an important turning point, and there are a few others. But yeah, around this period, it's pretty clear that he's interested in the perspectives of women, and is also more confident approaching those perspectives and trying to inhabit them.
I guess as it pertains to the book, if you guys don't know, the idea behind the series is there's one author paired with 1 year of the first year of the 2000s. And I think you've spoken a little bit about the process of that, some of the years were taken when they approached you, Fireflies that is, publishing house. I'm curious, would, like, so Déjà Cinema came out in 2005. If 2005 wasn't available to you, would Hong have been something you wanted to pursue? Because when I was reading the book, I got the sense, I'm like, this is the perfect film to kind of revolve a book around when you're going to talk about all his films. So like if 2007, for example, was available, would that have been still something you wanted to pursue with Hong, or was Déjà Cinema like the key for you?
I don't know. I mean, they, you know, this wasn't even my idea in a way, because like they approached me, you know, Fireflies, I think, had writers in mind, and they approached me with years and like just started a conversation. They approached me immediately saying that they wanted me to write about Hong, and that 2005 was available. And I really didn't have to think very hard, because for me this film was always an important film. And just thinking about it a little bit, it seemed like a film in which I could distill a lot of what I wanted to say about Hong. it was pretty clear that Fireflies, I mean, I'm really glad that a lot of people have picked up the book today, but I recommend the whole series. It's a really interesting way to approach, sort of film criticism today. I mean, they've really given the writers free rein. I think the books are all quite different, and they gave us a very, I think just the mandate was just to use one film as a way, as an entry point into whatever else you wanted to talk about. So, my idea was always to write a book not just about one Hong film, which is an impossible and kind of absurd exercise anyway. So the idea was always to use one Hong film as an entry point, and to take a more prismatic approach, and to look at the entire body of work. And this film seemed like the best entry point. I think there are other films that would have worked. I think Turning Gate also works. I think a few others might have worked, but this was the one I mean, we can talk more about it. I can get into it now if you want, but there are certain things that this film does that I think are really key to the Hong project, and are also, like, for me, really important things about cinema today. And so I really wanted to. When they told me this was the film they had in mind, I was on board right away.
Yeah, I'm sure most of you know we've done book launches for 2 other books in the series, Inland Empire and 10 Skies, but there's also one on Goodbye Dragon Inn, which is excellent, which we would have done a launch for if it wasn't COVID. There's more to come. They're going to announce, I think, the rest of I think Headless Woman's next, and then they have 5 more coming, which are to be announced. But I guess, yeah, as it regards Tale of Cinema, which is the next film we're showing, it is a key film in a lot of ways. You point out in the book, it's the first film that a lot of the devices that we've come to know and appreciate Hong for started in that film, and it also marked the end of a lot of things he was doing up to that point. The ones that kind of started at that point were the Zoom, which I'm sure was in Haewon, if I'm not mistaken, and voiceover. The first director character was in this film, or filmmaking.
Second one,
okay.
But
And,
it's the first film that actually is about, really foregrounds
filmmaking, yeah. And it was the last time there was any kind of sex or nudity, which, if you've only watched recent Hongs and you go back and watch some of their early ones, it's kind of like, whoa, there's sex scenes in these movies, but there were quite a few in the early ones, and then it kind of stopped after Tale of Cinema. I don't know if you have any, you do get into this in the book, but just in general, like, have any thoughts on what was shifting in his process at this point, where he was getting away from, I think it had to do with how he was writing the films, which I'm sure you'll discuss too, but he was starting to get away from from writing in a traditional way.
It was a pretty gradual process. I assume if those of you know about Hong, you know this, that he's, at this point in his career, and for some years now, he does not write scripts before production. He writes his scenes every morning. He shoots more or less chronologically. But it was sort of a gradual process of attrition. There were scripts for the first few films, and then there were treatments. And Tale of Cinema is from the treatment period. And then around the time of, I think OP's movie was the first film he made without even a treatment. Yeah, and I think that is a really important aspect of his work. It shapes the work, and I think you feel what this process brings to it. It really informs the form of the films, and I think the tone of the films. And this was, besides the things that you mentioned, it's also the first film he self-produced.
Right.
So I think this, just psychologically, it's kind of it's an important, sort of liberating. It's like I'm not fully dependent on. This is a lot more freedom, as producing through his own production company. And I mean, I really love that it's one of his most reflexive films, and it's a film about, and also it's called Tale of Cinema. I mean, it's like, if you're gonna write a book, why not write a book called Tale of Cinema about a film book? But also it's reflexive in a way that allows you to think about other Hong films, because some of you, I know have seen the film, and some of you haven't, and I don't want to say too much about it, but it's about autobiography. It's about the process of creating autofiction, what it means to use your life as the material for your art, is the subject of this film, and it's something that Hong is often thought to do or accused of doing. You know, it's like, you know, he just makes films about himself. You know, they're all self-referential. And this film dramatizes that, thematizes it. It's about that process, and also has fun with it. So this seems like kind of the perfect way to enter the Hong world for me.
Yeah, it is kind of a slippery topic to like assign autobiographical things to his films, but I'm wondering if you think, which I get this sense as he's matured and, or just started to make more films and got written about more, especially in the US, it feels like maybe the films like Tale of Cinema had more actual autobiographical elements in it, as opposed to now, which he seems to almost play with that idea. Like he knows that everyone's looking into his films for that reason.
They're meta-autobiographical, I guess.
What was that?
They're meta
Yes, exactly, yes.
Right.
But there's like, you know, the Tale of Cinema, without giving anything away, like deals with suicide in some ways. And one of the things you talk about in the book is how Hong is early on talked about how he attempted suicide once, which is something he doesn't talk about now. Like early on, he was talking more.
He doesn't talk about it, but he put it in one of his most recent films, In Front of Your
Right in front of your face, which
talks
has some interesting parallels with Tale of Cinema. But do you think there was, if you're going to read any personal autobiographical elements in his films, do you think there were probably more in these Turning Gate, Tale of Cinema, and then he maybe moved away from that as people were starting to think more, especially in the Kim Yi years?
I don't know. I think it's a constant. I think they're always there. And I think I spent a week with Hong in New York, like just a month ago. We did a retrospective, and like I kept thinking, like some of the stuff is going to end up in a film. It was, you know, it was also a weirdly eventful week because he came with like a pain in his face, which was just this really, you know, sort of dramatic way to start a retrospective. You know, I pick him up in his hotel and he complains about this like acute stabbing pain in his cheek, and I'm like, great. And now we have, and so it, you know, there's this whole series of like, every day I'm calling like doctors and acupuncturists, and like eventually it turns out he has an infected tooth that has to be extracted. So I find a dentist who can do it, and like this is like in the middle of the week when he's doing Q&As every night. Yeah, and he was an incredibly good sport about it. He showed up with his, you know, face all puffy from like having a tooth extraction. So I was like, this seems like something he would use at some point. And yeah, but you know, I think the autobiography thing is an interesting. He doesn't use it in the spirit of revelation, confession, or exposure. It's the philosophy of filmmaking is to use what is at hand, and what is at hand is your life as you live it. For him, it's like, you know, he's using the material around. He's using what he observes. He's using what he and the people around him experience, and then he turns that into cinema. And that is very clearly what he's always done. And I think he's become, in a way, even more radical with that as a practice, as he's gotten older. Actually, I think in some ways he's a more radical filmmaker today.
There was a question asked. You recently did a Lincoln Center talk about Hong, and there's a podcast about it if you guys want to listen to it via film comments. But a woman near the end asked a very funny question, doesn't like the Hong films, and says some humorous things. But she says something interesting in there that is not addressed. She talks about you know, how her and her film club don't like these movies, and she says they're very French. She thought of when she watches them. I'm wondering if, because I'm trying to think of when Hong, it took a while for Hong to catch on for U.S. festivals, but he was essentially embraced by like Cannes and French cinema circles early on. Do you think there's something, for, I mean, all the filmmakers that people compare him to are French in general, you know, Romer, Pilon, whoever. Is there something you think that is inherently, or like, and he also references Bresson a lot, he loves Bresson. So there's all these French references with his work. Is there something French to his filmmaking that took a while for US, I don't know, organizations and distributors to catch on to? Because what was his first film in New York Film Festival, Turning Gate, and then it was still slow to even, it took a while for his films to start getting like regular US distribution. just wondering if there's something like culturally specific that it's not. It took a while. Now everyone seems to love them, but it
I
took
don't
a
know.
while.
I mean, if they were really that French, you would think they would be more exportable, because that's like the most exportable kind of art film.
It's true.
Right? And so, I think it has to do with the difficulty of placing him. I mean, he's remains and has always been a very elusive figure. He comes from Korea, but the films don't seem aligned with the Korean cinema of the time, which is a lot more like interested in genre and socio-political commentary. And with Hong, I think he didn't really fit that easily in that world, which is why I think people always said, oh, he's the French. And it's easy to talk about Romer, and I mean, some of his films are quite referential of Romer. I mean, like Night and Day has a very Romerian structure, and his characters always going to the beach, like Romer's characters, and so I think there's there are affinities, but yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with I think we talked about this earlier today, like how Hong, when I discovered him, and probably when you did too, he was not so easy. He was not the most accessible filmmaker. You had to catch his films at the festival. And they were, for the first 10 years of his career, he was not distributed at all. And I think that just has to do with, it was not a great time for, art film distribution. I thought the 2000s were terrible for that, which is one reason I got into programming, honestly. I think we live in I think maybe the size of the audience has changed, but films are way more accessible today than they were 10, 15 years ago, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to show Haewon is because that movie screened one time in LA Film Fest. Some people might remember that festival doesn't even exist anymore, and the movie didn't have distribution. Subsequently, it's got distribution from Cinema Guild, who picked up a lot of films, belatedly, as has Grasshopper. But Taylor Cinema never had a U.S. theatrical run, and really none of his films did. Some of them did, but right now, Wrong Man in 2015 signaled like a huge shift where almost all his films, give or take, Hill of Freedom or something, have all come out and had normal runs, because Acropolis is, we've had to show a number of them because they still don't get LA runs, but obviously the last few years have been a lot better for that, which is nice. But I'm curious from like a writing process. You've written one other book, or you've worked on other books, but the most recent one was David Lynch, Man from Another Place. I don't know if you can talk conceptually or just like from a writing standpoint, if any, what differed for you for these two books? It seemed, I mean, it's been a few years since I read the Lynch one, but it goes more or less chronologically. The Hong film, of course, is more charismatic and jumps around to all his films. So I'm curious how you went about conceptualizing this one and how the writing process might have differed from your other book.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there were different publishers, and different needs, and the Lynch book was also part of a series of sort of critical biographies, and that was more of a mass market book. Although I wasn't really given very many restrictions for that one either. But chronologically seemed to make sense for that one, although I tried to introduce thematic elements. For this book, it was strange. I spent a lot of time just taking notes and watching films and thinking about the structure. The writing was very easy once I had it down. I think I spent a year watching films and taking notes and playing with the structure, and then I wrote it in a few weeks.
So we can open it up to the audience too. If you have some questions. Right there.
Yeah, this is actually my second Hong film. The first was The Day After, which I saw at Cannes. And I'm curious whether I saw some similarities in the performances, the performance style. I wouldn't call it deadpan, I wouldn't call it naturalism. There's something about this very specific. I'm curious whether you consider that sort of a Hong trademark, I guess, or something about his voice, and whether all his films could exist in the same universe in your mind.
In terms of performance or general?
Yes.
I'm always a little wary of judging performances like in a language I don't speak. So I don't know exactly. I feel like we're always missing out on nuances if we're not native speakers. But for me, I think one underrated aspect of Hong is how great he is with actors. I think the actors in his films are incredible across the board. And I think you're right in that there's something odd about the acting style. And I think a big part of it is how he writes. The actors don't have scripts until minutes before the camera rolls. So there's a certain, almost like anxiety that maybe filters into the scene. They have almost no time to memorize their lines. And even though there's a sort of impression of casualness to the films, the dialogue is a little bit like baggy, but when he gives them the lines, they are supposed to read them like verbatim. He doesn't want them to change anything. So they have to memorize lines in a matter of minutes, and then the cameras roll. So that's a pretty unusual way for an actor to work. And I think that might inform the acting style. And I think, the films are premised on, there are always these table scenes, there are always these like kind of eruptions of emotion, and I think they require like real acting. Like, they're real like pretty elaborate displays of emotion, I think, in most of his films. And some people here probably know, I mean, the actors he works with are really, some of them are really well known in Korea. They're great actors who work in commercial cinema, and are, I think some of them in television. But yeah, I think he's this is where I think you mentioned French filmmakers, and the one I really think has a lot in common with Hong, even though it's not obvious at all on the surface, is Bresson. And I think, if you read Bresson's notes on the cinematograph, you will find that almost every line in that book applies to Hong's practice. But the acting is interesting because obviously in Bresson it's always about like this, you're just this model. You're like, you're supposed to like suppress everything and just be, repetition will drill all the emotion out of you. And I don't think Hong wants that. He still values spontaneity and immediacy and a certain documentary quality, which I think is what this process of his, enables.
I always find it funny too that, in most cases, or seems to, maybe you can correct this, he meets the actors on a personal level and then decides that he wants to work with them, and in a lot of cases doesn't even know what they made before.
He doesn't.
It's like, I don't watch the movies.
Yeah, it's just about like people he wants to work with, he says, and he doesn't necessarily know what they've been in.
But we have other questions? Right there.
Like kind of jumping off of that, having seen a lot of Hong Sang-soo movies, one of the like comparisons I initially made was with him and Ozu. And in the book, at first there's like this part near the beginning where you like kind of list a lot of the people that people compare Hong Sang-soo to. Ozu wasn't originally in that list, but then later in the book, you do reference Ozu as one of the common comparisons. This isn't something I thought about until just now, but interestingly, I feel like Ozu, with his actors, was known for picking people based on who they were as people, rather than who they were as performers, right? So like Shisha Ryu was known, at least within that group, or at least portrays himself as being someone who's like not an actor, he's just a person, and that Ozu like somehow, I guess, had some kind of a draw to who he was and like would just direct him. Similarly, it seems like that's something that like Hong Sang-soo has, where it's like he finds actors that he connects with the people, as people before as performers. Is that like a parallel that you see? Or?
I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it, but I agree. And I think it's interesting, this idea of working with actors, professional actors, as non-actors in a way, because it's almost like You know, I think this line is something he plays with, because they have to be professional actors. They have to deliver. They have to be believable. They have to deliver these lines. You know, they have to be able to drink while acting, which is, you know, also a skill set. There's, yeah, but he basically casts them as if they're non-professionals because he has no idea what they've been in some cases. Yeah.
Anyone else? Let's go with Bay actually.
I don't know if you have more insight about it, but the two things from Hong that strike me the most are, well, I guess it's this artist that just furiously outputs work non-stop. Like, I think a lot of people, you know, they take time, whether it's means of production or just reflecting on the work, but Hong, it just seems like, you know, like rapid fire. And so, I don't know if you know more in terms of like that drive that takes him there, like this intellectual like just crave that he has. And I guess the other thing for him that I found parallel with some filmmakers is just this distillation of cinema. That perhaps, as you mentioned, he started with scripts and sort of like a more, you know, standard way of production up until now that it's, you know, the cameras that he uses, the way that he goes about it of just writing the day before or the day of kind of thing, and just, you know, being concrete about it. That's the thing that this is cinema for me. This is the thing that I'm reacting or getting on.
Yeah, we'll start with the first part. The idea of this, you know, extreme productivity is interesting. I did ask him about this in New York, and I should just say he was actually in incredible form despite his tooth pain and everything. And we put some of the videos online, and the long talk that we did, I actually transcribed it and published it in the New Yorker as an interview. And I think I recommend reading that as an insight into Hong. He was incredibly candid and said a lot of things I hadn't heard before. And this is one of the things I asked him about, was just this, you know, compulsion to produce. And for him, he's just very matter of fact about it. It's just like, it's just what he does. And I think he sees it as a practice. It's almost like, you know, meditating or doing yoga or whatever. Like this, he practices filmmaking, and this is just what he does. And I think what's really interesting is that when you look at the history of cinema, it's not unprecedented. Filmmakers have worked at this pace before. I mean, I guess in the studio system, they usually they write their own scripts, but you know, studio directors would make a film a year back in, you know, the golden age of Hollywood. And if you look at careers like Godard or Fassbinder, they certainly work at least as quickly. But I think when those kinds of filmmakers work like that quickly, there's like an urgency, almost a kind of a manic quality to the work. But with Hong, there's like a calm and a serenity which is why I liken it to a practice. This is just what he does. The way he talks about the filmmaking, he doesn't even have an idea when he really just, he puts film shoots on the calendar. You know, I mean, I mentioned the way you would schedule like a cleaning at a dentist. You would be like, I'm gonna shoot a film in September. That is the first step before I have an idea for a film. So I think that's a really interesting and important reversal of like how people think of art making. Just like, I'm making a film this year, and that's the first step. The second step is, I'm gonna find people who are free to work with me, and I'm gonna find locations that are available. This also is a reversal, because usually in fiction film, you write a script and it's like, I need to find an actor who can match his character, I need to find locations that like are the ones that I've written. So he's completely reversed it, and in so doing, he's removed time and money from the equation of filmmaking, which is like, I think, an incredibly radical thing for a narrative filmmaker to do today. So I think a lot of it has to do with his process. This is why he produces as much as he does, and this is why he makes these kinds of films. Sorry, your second part, I'm not sure, I like what you said, but like, what was exactly the question that?
I guess it's
Yeah, I think in some ways it is a search for the essential. I think that is sort of how I would characterize the process. And he went through the system the way everybody, most people who make films do. He goes to film school, he finds producers, he writes scripts, he develops them. But I think at a certain point he asks himself, like, how can you make the work without those steps, without those, and this is why I think Hong is such an important filmmaker for young artists, I really believe he should be taught in film schools, not as a model to replicate, but just the idea that you can liberate yourself. I think the idea of independent film it's so hollowed out. Like we don't even know what we mean when we use independent as a brand. It's a descriptor that is a genre, but like Hong has really tried to be independent, in a very literal way of like removing the strictures of filmmaking, which is a very expensive art form, and one that is inhibiting for a lot of people. And I think if more people thought that way, we might have different films.
He's also been doing more of the work himself as he's gone along. He shoots most of his, or all of his films now. It's a score, it's just like taking on more of the labor himself too. There's like less and less crew, right? I don't know there's a handful of people at most on set.
Obviously there are a lot of filmmakers who work this way in more artisanal way, but they tend to be more, experimental filmmakers or documentarians, with pretty much like a one-person operation or just one or two people. But for people to make narrative films this way, I think that's really pretty rare.
Right there.
I have a chance to read your book yet, but I was wondering if you ever wrote about his background as a classical pianist. Because that was when I learned that it made sense to me. Because I was like, I think of his movies often playing with structure, repetitions on the theme, as music, right? Almost like composing music.
Yeah, I mentioned that. I don't really get into it. I talk about a lot about how he went to. There's a bit in the book where I bring in the other arts, and he went to film schools. He went to film departments of art schools, and was exposed to the other arts, which I think is also important. He went to California College of the Arts and also to the Art Institute of Chicago. So I think there's a certain mindset that's also different, and music is I think he, if I'm not mistaken, that he really just dabbled in music, but he's now, as Jordan said, is composing the very lo-fi sort of piano scores for his films.
There was one other one here before. Right there.
I have a question about his editing process. I know he told you that it takes him like a week now, or like
It takes him a day.
a day. I was just interested, like, if that has always, do you know if that has always been that fast, or if it's another one of the aspects of the process that has like been pared away?
I asked him this 5 years ago, and the answer then was like a day. So I don't know if I think if you shoot chronologically and your shooting ratio is pretty low, if writing as you go, you know what you're going to shoot. You know you're going to use the scene. You just and it's just a matter of shooting, of selecting. But yeah, I think since probably the last 10 years, it's probably been as fast as that. He, in addition to the film In Front of Your Face, which was just released here, and then there's another one he made. That was his 26th film. He's up to 29 already. Yeah, so.
I'll be soon. We can do one more here.
I've heard he says not many, and I don't know what not many means, right? I mean, I think it's fewer than 10, although some of them are pretty long, so. I have heard an actor, Yoon Jung from, who was in Minari, who won the Oscar for Minari, is in some of his films. This always plays these wonderful comic roles. And when I talked to her about Hong, she was like, oh, she's way too many. She was really infuriated by his process. It's like really unhappy. So I guess for her it was too many. he described it as not that many. So I don't know. I would say, my guess is just 10 or under. I again recommend the Hong talks that we did in New York a month ago. He was really quite forthcoming.
Is there anything else? We're getting close to the end here, but there was one thing, it's only mentioned briefly in the book, and there's maybe nothing to say about it, but there's not much, maybe social politics in his films, but no actual politics really in his movies. And you mentioned one thing one interpretation that's been floated. Is there a reflection that the bifurcated structures in his films, or the complicated structures or two-part structures can be thought of as reflections on a divided Korea?
That's not my
It's not you. This is
Yeah,
one thing you referenced. Someone else has said this, which is the only interesting thing I've ever heard about his films from a political standpoint. I don't know if there's anything that you can add to what his film. I don't know if he's ever mentioned anything like that when you talked to him. But that was one thing in the book. I was like, that's interesting, but I don't know if that really.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the whole project is political in the sense of like rejecting the entire structure of filmmaking today. But to me, that's like maybe as political as it gets. So refusing to be part of the system. But I mean, so he's in a way embodying it. But he really would never be the kind. For me, he's like the last filmmaker who's interested in social realism. I feel like this is like not his thing at all. And I want to just come back. It just occurred to me like your question about like the essence of cinema, and I think I think for Hong, the essence of cinema is not storytelling. It is, for him, cinema is about an expression of thought. It's like the cinema is a medium of thought. It's an instrument of thought. And increasingly, I think that's like, for me at least, those are the important filmmakers. I mean, that's not mutually exclusive with storytelling, but I think
I think you quote him as saying agnostic, or just think of himself as a
yeah,
storyteller.
he
takes
describes
fragments
himself
and-
as primarily a storyteller, but he has, it's interesting because he does so much with narrative and so much with structure, but he does so in the service of, I think, like larger philosophical questions about the mind and reality and how we perceive the world and how we navigate it and like relationships between people. And so I think the films always come back to these larger ideas. And for me, I think what's wonderful about them is how he does it with this lightness of touch. And I think they're like really philosophical films that are also funny and kind of irreverent, and they don't take themselves that seriously. And I think this is a pretty difficult line he was. Tricky.
Agreed. Well, thank you guys for sticking around. We'll take a 10-15 minute break and then come back and watch Déjà Cinema. The bar is open, grab a drink.
Around two if anybody wants to chat more.
Yeah, and Dennis will be around to sign books if you haven't gotten one. Thank you.